Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Corporate Services, Climate Change and Scrutiny Management Committee. We have a number of officers who'll be joining us at various points through the meeting, and I'll give you a shout when it's your turn to come to the table. If we begin with apologies, I've received two apologies from Councillor Danny Myers, and he's replaced by Councillor Margaret Wells. Welcome, Councillor Wells. And from Councillor Paula Widdowson, who's substituted by Councillor Keith Orrell. Welcome. We begin with declarations of interest. Do members wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or other registrable interest they may have in respect of the business on this agenda? No? Oh, Councillor Waller.
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of the discussions that might take place with regard to 106, I put on the record, it's already on the register, but I am a governor at York High School, so it's one of the questions that I'm minded to ask later. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other interests? No. So if we move on to the minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of December 2023 on pages 3 to 8. Do any members have any comments on the accuracy of the minutes? No, we're happy to approve those as an accurate record. Yes, thank you. In terms of matters arising, on page 5 there was a suggestion of a task and finish group being established to discuss cost and benefits of the council's approach to communication with an engagement with residents. I suggest we pick that up under the work plan item. Councillor Taylor.
Sorry, Chair. Mic working. Thanks. Got a little boom box here. I've just had a message from Councillor Kelly saying she can't get into the room. Hey, there we go. Sorry, sorted. Never mind.
No, that's best. What was I saying? Yes, so the suggested task and finish group topic we can pick up under work plan. So I think that was the only matter arising from the minutes I was going to pick up on. Before we go to public participation, agenda item 5 today, workforce development plan and attendance management. Unfortunately, the officer who was due to present that report is not available due to unforeseen circumstances, and no other officer is available to present the report. So I'd like to seek members' permission for us to defer a discussion on I thought was a really interesting report. So I would like to seek permission to defer that item if members are content. What I would like to suggest also is that I know I had some questions arising from the report, that if members do have questions or any comments they want to raise, rather than us just leave it for a number of months, I would like to capture any comments or questions that members had. So if you do have questions on that report you would like to pass on, please, if you can send them through to Jane Mellor, the Democracy Officer. And Jane, if you're happy to collate those and forward them on to Helen Whiting, just so we don't lose the opportunity to raise any questions or comments that we had on that report. But we shall return to it. Okay. Agenda item 3 is public participation. We have two speakers this evening, one joining us remotely and one in person. So we will begin with our remote participant, who is Flick Williams, who is joining us via Zoom.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Shall I begin?
Yes, please. Sorry.
Elected members, I'm here today to speak on an issue related to the climate change remit of this committee. Last Wednesday, an executive decision session received a policy paper on the social model of disability, which was adopted unanimously by full council in October 2022. Contained therein was the statement, I quote, "There is often a focus on changes to the built environment and travel which impact negatively on disabled people. The council will work to avoid any form of eco-ableism," end quote. Not remotely controversial, one would have thought. Last York Environment Week featured an open meeting on the topic of eco-ableism in its programme. The policy paper was written in genuine co-production with about 15 disabled people who volunteered for the task, including new faces for whom disability is part of their academic studies. However, at the session, a statement was read out from one half of the executive member for Environment and Climate Emergency, stating eco-ableism is, and I quote, "a term used to whip up a culture war." Firstly, eco-ableism is a concept recognised by Friends of the Earth, Curious Earth, the Greeneration Foundation, and many other environmental organisations. Are they whipping up culture wars, I wonder, or simply recognising the challenges to being inclusive in their sustainability mission? And let's be very clear, the accusation of creating division and stoking culture wars is a tactic used by the right wing of politics to shut down progressivism and often free speech. It's an evolution of that previously often heard term, political correctness gone mad, ableist in itself, to shut down those with a different worldview. Fundamentally, to attack our use of the term eco-ableism is to silence the disability rights movement's assertion that environmental policies are in many cases exacerbating the oppression experienced by disabled people in our society. Would the executive member not accept the concept of environmental racism, perhaps, because that is the equivalent articulated by another oppressed group? It is reprehensible that any member of the executive who took no part in the meetings to write this policy seeds more division with such a wholly inappropriate accusation, all of which totally undermines the participation of so many disabled people who gave freely of their time and limited energy to assist this council to make progress. It is impossible to make positive change if we are to be censored in articulating what the problems actually are and how we express that. Much is spoken about lived experience when it suits. Eco-ableism is our lived experience, and we do not accept being admonished on an issue that is increasingly contributing to our disablement by society. We await an apology. Thank you.
Thank you, Flick. And I should have said at the beginning that you were speaking in relation to the remit of the committee rather than in relation to any specific item on our agenda. Thank you for that. If I can now invite Gwen Swinburne to join us at the table, who will be talking about governance matters both on and off today's agenda.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just point out a significant error in the absence management section of the report? It has as a head count a 500 count decrease. It was raised at the Staffing and Urgency Committee. It's actually been an increase in staff, so
okay.
Perhaps they could republish the table for your next agenda item.
Yeah, we can check that. Okay, so you know the score. You have 3 minutes in your own time.
Thank you, Chair. May I express my thanks for the committee's significant effort on the draft Combined Authority Constitution, particularly ensuring our best-in-class webcasting, web retention and public speaking protocols are replicated in the Combined Authority. May I ask, Chair, what are the plans for the Joint Committee addressing the remaining 5 chapters ahead of the next meeting of the Combined Authority? Next, the Section 106 report deviates from our standard report protocols, including the absence of an equalities impact section. Had this been present, the democratic deficit of the deprived in awards would have needed to be highlighted. Unlike parish councils that will receive CIL money, the in awards will have no such democratic mechanism, and we can look forward to staffers handing out our money to the wealthy out awards as they have always done under the Section 106, or let it sit doing nothing. As a consequence, may I ask, Chair, for 2 actions? You commission a review of the disparate committee report protocols to ensure standardisation, inclusion of all key sections every time, all background papers being electronically linked, all having version controls and named specialist implications officers, and always having chief officer sign-offs, as well as phone and emails for the report authors. I know I shouldn't have to ask this, Chair, but it's ridiculous now. Secondly, can I also ask that the soon-to-be-appointed Director of Housing and Communities prepare for this committee or ANG a terms of reference for a citywide community governance review, addressing both the current baseline democratic governance inequalities and failures, impacts negatively mainly on the inner wards, but not only, as well as a plan for both creating town and parish councils or parish councils in the inner wards and review the outer parishes. North Yorkshire Council has an excellent set of templates and Gantt charts. Whilst election staffers will need to be involved at some point for the line drawing, etc., the more strategic governance piece needs to be done by the communities team, in my view. They also need to address the entirely dysfunctional so-called ward committees, just throwing good money after bad. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So on the matter of the review of the draft combined authority constitution, we'll pick up under the work plan item how we move forward with that enjoyable piece of work, which and necessary. So thank you for the reminder. Okay, so that brings us to the end of public participation. So we now move on to agenda item 4, section 106 agreements and community infrastructure levy. So if I can ask officers and executive members to join us at the table and do feel free to call on backup as and when needed. And I'll ask you to to introduce yourselves before we get into the report. Just by way of background, this was an item that was carried over from the previous iteration of this committee. Section 106 agreements has been an item of long-standing interest, and I think it was not long after I became a councillor. I think it was former Councillor Gunnell was always a very vocal proponent of digging into section 106 and better understanding how the process works and how what role councillors play in its functioning. So it is something that we have been wanting to look at for some time. The timing works quite well in terms of the authority consulting on arrangements for the introduction of the community infrastructure levy. So now seems as good a time as any to for us to discuss this topic. One, not word of warning, request. When we get to talk about the functioning of section 106, it would probably be helpful if we don't get too far involved in discussions on specific schemes, some of which may be in the process of conditions being discharged, and that would probably be not terribly wise or helpful. So if we can keep our comments at a sort of more general level, and by all means touching on themes and concerns, but without necessarily feeling the need to link them to individual projects, that would be appreciated. So I will ask officers to briefly introduce themselves. How I propose we structure the discussion is focus initially on the section 106 elements of the paper, and then have a discussion about community infrastructure levy and questions that officers may have around percentages, parish councils, neighbourhood plans, and how all of that will work. Because I think it's a fairly sort of new and interesting concept that we're getting our head around. So if I can ask James and Becky if you'd like to introduce yourselves and briefly introduce the paper, which I'm sure all members have read and digested.
Thanks, Chair. I'm James Gilchrist. I'm the Director for Environment, Transport and Planning.
I'm Becky Eads, Head of Planning and Development Management.
Thank you.
Okay. So the report is specifically around planning obligations, which are section 106 agreements, and how these are negotiated through the planning application process. There is a specific focus in the report on public open space element due to request of the chair. The report explains how 106s work and how they are secured through the process. We have just literally had some training with members that explained how 106s work, and more importantly, the need for an evidence base to be able to make, I'm sorry, that's me rattling, an evidence base around how the contributions are requested. So there's a report talks about there can be different types of obligations, how they're paid and delivered. It then talks about specifically around the open space and how we use an evidence base for this, how the assessment is made of the need in the area. It then talks about sports and recreation. You've got a specific table in there that again works around an evidence base. It then talks around how once we have secured the 106 through the process, how we then monitor and spend the money once it comes in. The recommendation is that the contents of the report are noted. And I think, and if there is any specific questions around any applications per se, if anybody wants to email me outside of this meeting, I'm quite happy to look that up if needed.
I think just one thing before we move on, and Becky can detail this, is just that SIL is available everywhere. It's not just for those outer wards, it's just that the process for administering it is different, whether you've got a parish or not, but it is still applicable everywhere.
Yeah.
I don't really want to add anything, Becky, on that.
No, okay. I'll cover it when we come to
Okay,
it.
thank you for that. And if we sort of park the SIL discussion in terms of the mechanics of it, I think that'll be helpful. And it is helpful to see the process laid out in terms of how section 106 works. It's particularly helpful to see the figures in the report to give an idea of the scale of the monies that we do receive on the back of section 106 contributions. I'll open up to members to raise any comments or questions. I think what I'd like to suggest is that we initially start by talking about the identification of local needs and opportunities for 106 funding to be invested, and then how that money is spent. Because those are the two questions that certainly from a member's perspective often come up, and I know that the report helpfully sets out how there's a very much kind of a data-driven and evidence-driven approach to identifying the need and opportunities for beneficiaries for those contributions. But it would be helpful if members have any questions around that process. And then moving on to how the money is actually invested and how we sort of monitor the spend and what opportunities there are for members to have perhaps sort of greater visibility as to the status of spend on various projects. So that's how I sort of propose to start it off. It may be that the questions that colleagues raise leads us in other directions, but that's absolutely fine as well. So who would like to start? Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the report, officers. It's welcomed. I have two questions, if I may. One is around, so I accept, obviously, officers need to work to an evidence base for sort of working out who should get what can be done with 106 money. But when I read that, I thought, in certain cases, might there be moments where there might be a sort of space between an evidence base on paper for whatever provision, be it open space provision or sports provision, and then so you've got what's on paper, and then you've got the reality of the here and now. So you might have a sports pitch or club, but do we know like how busy that club might be at the point at which money might be allocated. So certain areas of the city get more popular than others, teams grow, they shrink. Allotments get busy, then they might not be as busy. What I'm trying to get is I'm assuming officers will know where certain things are across the city, how big they are, how many people are involved in, but how up to date are our sort of records when it comes to assessing an evidence base for determining how much money should go somewhere. So that's my first question.
So we'll take that one first, and then we can move on to.
Yeah,
To
cool.
for the
Does it even
question.
make sense? Yeah, it
Yeah, makes
does, yeah,
sense.
sure.
But it needs to be relative to the development that it relates to. So say,
Yeah.
for example, if it's 50 houses, that'll be a very different request to 800 houses.
Mhm.
So it's based on the level of contribution that we've required and then what it could then be spent on, if that makes sense, in terms of an open space. So you couldn't ask for a whole new play space for 50, but you could for 800. And then
Yeah.
we'd potentially expect it to be on site and taken on as part of the larger site. So it all depends on the size of the site and where it is. And then, yes, very clearly, we do have an evidence base where officers will look at what there is in the area. But then it'll, as I've just said, the size of the development and how quickly it will come on board, because 106s have triggers. So it might be that on occupation of your 5th house, of your 100th house, and then you'd have to look and see when that was going to come on board in terms of timing to the requirements. So it's all based on what evidence we have and the size of the development.
I think just to add, the evidence base is required legally, not just by us as officers. But what does happen is those specialist officers within the council, when they rely on that evidence base, but when they come forward in response to an application, they will interpret that evidence base in terms of their request for the scheme, if that makes sense. So that element of interpretation, I suppose, and flexing the system, there is a little bit there, but it's got to be fed by that evidence base in the first place.
That's helpful, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Chair. So I think I know which sort of officers or officer groups are responsible for the open spaces element and the sports provision element. And the answer is probably very obvious, but it's still a mystery to me. So for things like highway sustainability measures, who looks at that in the council? And my reason for asking is because I've seen 106 agreements in my time as a councillor, and sometimes I've seen things and I've been like, where on earth's that come from? Like, no, I won't go into specifics because, you know, I respect what you've asked for, Chair, but, you know, there's a particularly large development that's taking place, mostly in Holgate Ward, and there's like, it's a sort of active travel provision, and it's at the end of the document, and no one's ever asked for this thing, and everyone I've asked, be them a council officer or a staff member from the related development, no one seems to know whose idea it was to put it in, and it's just baffled me. That's a very vague example, but the question remains.
I think so. There is a team that looks at and I suppose the evidence base is subtly different for transport. So certainly on significant projects, there will be a travel assessment done as part of the application to understand what that does to existing network in terms of impact. And then the asks are directly in response to that impact and how that impact can be mitigated. So rather than a static evidence base, which we rely on, that tends to be a much more dynamic process for transport impacts. And they sit within, obviously the consultants will bring it forward and then my team will check it within the transport service. But if there are specifics you want us to go away and dig at, you can certainly go away and try and dig at those specifics.
And just to add, if councillors do spot something and think, where has that come from? There is the opportunity for us to challenge, or is there a line that mustn't be crossed in terms of?
If your 106 has already been negotiated and signed, you can't challenge it. But what you can do is come to officers and ask for further information, how we got there, absolutely come and ask us a question. We can't renegotiate it once it's been signed,
Yeah.
unless it's agreed with the parties and.
Yeah.
as we
And I know that
discussed.
does come up at planning committees where members have looked at the list of benefiting schemes, and that has raised questions, but by that point it's too late. Which is hopefully some of the issues we can explore in this session. I've got quite a few hands. Were there any questions relating to that particular topic? I'll ask Councillor Healy, then Councillor Rowley, then Councillor Merritt.
On the last point, that there doesn't seem to be an appropriate time for us as councillors to represent views of our constituents before the 106 is signed. So how would we articulate that to you so that you can take it into consideration before you sign the 106?
Well, I think there's obviously a consultation period with any planning application, so those representations to a certain extent are triggered when that statutory consultation period starts, I suppose, about because the section 106 is directly related to the impact. So if there are impacts being identified, they should be drawn out through the consultation period for the planning application. So I would say that's the time, as early as possible, in effect, to start to identify what those impacts and what the mitigations might be.
So is this suggestion that sort of councillors would comment on the planning application as would any resident, say, if the development were to go ahead, we would want to see investment in the following local amenities?
Yes, but I think we need to be realistic that it has to come back to that evidence base.
Yeah.
And if that evidence base doesn't defend it, then it doesn't stand up to the legal tests that are outlined in the paper.
Councillor Rowley said had supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, it's kind of linked very much to what Councillor Taylor and Councillor Healy have said. Really. It's more of a general question about 106, but when went to wait.
Hold that thought.
Okay.
And,
I was going to be.
no, that's fine. I'll come back to you. Councillor Merritt, was your question related to that specific topic?
It was to this section and the next one following Councillor Healy's comment. Obviously, in terms of members of the public who are interested, yes, they can object to an application and flag the types of things that they feel should be done. The issue comes when the heads of term for the section 106 are drawn up. What's their opportunity to comment? Because the first time they will see those is when the papers have been written for the planning committee after the closing date for consultation.
You can comment at any point during the planning application process, but the request is made by officers through the planning application process. It isn't a process that involves members of the public or members. It's based on our technical evidence through our experts that we consult as part of the process. So, for example, if it was highways that have made a request, that comes from a specific highways officer and their evidence base. And the same goes with public open space. That's based on that officer and their expertise. So that's how we make that assessment through the planning application process. It doesn't invite members or members of the public to be, there's not to say that once it's published as part of the planning, as part of the committee process, they can't comment, but that is an officer process, not a member process.
Okay, just to quickly follow up on that. Does that process potentially involve parish councils? I'm trying to think of when officers are gathering evidence and information to inform recommendations for 106. It wouldn't include any other outside bodies.
The vast majority of that evidence base should be written before an application is received. So the open space evidence base exists now. It's not something that is created in response to an application. It exists as an assessment of where we have got deficits of open space or where open space quality could be improved because of the increased usage. So that evidence base isn't something that is developed each time. It's an existing evidence base that we need to rely on. If we made it up each time, we then get that level of challenge.
Okay, I've got a couple of supplementaries. I will come back to your substantive question, Councillor Merritt. It's Councillor Orrell, then Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you, Chair. Is it a legal requirement not to involve members in this process of working out the 106?
It's not a legal requirement that members aren't involved. It's a standard planning process that officers negotiate a planning application. That's not a member's role to assess and make recommendations on planning applications. It is their role, obviously, to make the decision when it comes to committee, but the role of making the assessment and all the recommendations lies with officers.
I think what I would say is it's reflective of the council policies as well. So actually the member input quite often comes in those policies. So around transport, for instance, as it reflects.
You've gone, your microphone's gone on.
It should reflect the policies of the council, for instance, the transport policy or the will be, so the adoption of that policy is where members get involved in steering that.
Okay. Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you. Councillor Pavlovic, Exec Member for Housing and Planning. So I'm not a member of the committee, but I just wanted to add something to the contribution. When Becky and James are talking about officer involvement, it's not just planning officers, for example. It's public health, for example, in respect of open space. It's colleagues from the education department and across the council. So yes, ultimately the decision for writing up the section 106 is with a planning officer, but that's had a lot of feeding from other professionals within the council, and that's where, for example, one of the dangers of too much lobbying from individual members or ward members is that yes, that may involve something that you would like to see in your ward. They will take into account the needs of a wider demographic. So, for example, in a conversation that I had with the public health officer that's dealing with section 106, is yes, we have a lot of requests for football pitches, but we've also got an aging population that don't necessarily want to play football. And it may be that we need so that
You're pointing at me.
I was pointing at you, Councillor Oley, but only by accident. So it may be that we need other types of open space provision. It may be that we need more provision for a younger demographic. So it's not necessarily quite as straightforward as saying open space, let's have another football pitch.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Eyre.
Thank you, Chair. It was my substantive question, but I feel like the conversation's wandered its way around, and Councillor Pavlovic has introduced me perfectly, because it was around sport, and I think that is my general level of concern, having sat on many planning committees around that, and it's incredibly difficult. I take on board what Councillor Pavlovic has said, and it's a live conversation at the moment. We've had decades of cuts, and unfortunately the sport and active leisure team that we have in the council is considerably smaller than the one that we had when I was first elected in 2007. They do an amazing job in terms of the size they are, and they name me no names, but the evidence in here does show that that open space report was 2014. That's 10 years ago. The update is already 7 years old. So the actual document that James referred to, if we actually rely on a document, is already 7 years old and not fit for purpose. We will struggle to have capacity to update that. But of all the areas, I think the open space and play, it is the hardest one. And I really take on board James and Becky's point that having a simple policy that says, yeah, X, there we go, ticket box, that means we need 0.7 of a football pitch, point X of Y, point B of Y. It isn't as straightforward as that. So I wrote down 2 stupid examples. We don't have an awful lot, which goes to your older population as well, of 18-hole golf courses in the city centre. Because you're not going to put an 18-hole golf course in the city centre, but people in Guildhall might want to go and play residential golf on an afternoon. So that can't be spent. The people who buy those properties will want to play, may want to play golf, but won't want to play in the Guildhall, but the Section 106 has to be spent in the Guildhall. Similarly, we don't have a lot of rowing clubs in the suburbs because you require water to row on. So people in those areas might want to row, but that would have to be spent in the city centre. I'm not convinced we as a local authority have a good system for how we identify. And I'm not sure actually whether any authority has. I think it's something we could probably look at. Because it's very easy to say, and officers can do that, there will be a need for sport as a result of this development. To say what that sport is and where that sport need will actually end up being required is practically impossible. You don't know who's going to buy that house. You don't know whether they like archery. Darts obviously is becoming incredibly popular now. I'll class that as a sport. We may need more dartboards in places. I don't know. But nothing in a line-by-line document will allow officers to tick it and go, yeah, actually, yeah, 75 houses, that's 2 dartboards, a pool table, a snooker club, a croquet, a bowls. There isn't a system, and I don't know how we do that. And that's where I think ward and the parish and that bit of consultation is useful to actually have that local knowledge and go, you know what do the kids in your area do? What do the older people, what is it that they want to do? What are they missing? That's not something officers can sit at a desk and go, yeah, that's it. And that's why we do end up with certain things, football, rugby, thing, because existing sports clubs are easy to latch onto and go, well, there, we'll just expand those. But there isn't a real, and I don't know what that is. It probably is a piece of work for somebody. I'm not recommending this, but Councillor Taylor is obviously an avid sportsman and always volunteers for all sorts. So, but whether I do think it is something that we really need to look at and how we get best value out of doing that.
I don't know if you want to comment, James or Becky, in terms of, I suppose it's obviously, there is an evidence base that may be some years old, trends may have changed in the interim. There is a requirement to link the development to the beneficiary, and I suppose the further away you get, the harder that might be to justify. But is there more we could do?
I mean, I don't think this report pretends that there's nothing more we can do. There is always more we can do. So yes, there is. I mean, I think just to reflect back on the history of it, going back quite a while, there used to be Planning Policy Guidance 17, which was designed to do exactly those assessments that Councillor Ayres talked about, and that was scrapped and became part of the National Planning Policy Framework. So it's evolving all the time, the processes we go through, and if bits of those evidence base need review, that's stuff we can take away and discuss with the relevant officers. We have got those here. They might want to come in and comment.
Yeah, and
Becky, did you want to
take Becky's point around it's members lobbying for a particular venue is problematic. I suppose what Councillor was hinting at, and something that I've thought about, is there a way of kind of feeding in intelligence? Not in a way that says, and you should funnel money in this direction, but from ward teams or ward committees where we don't have parish councils, but as some kind of entity to say, here's some information which may or may not be of any use at all.
I think the simple answer to that is yes, through the evidence base that needs looking at and revising. I'm looking at the 2 people sat behind me now. I'm going to pull Dave and Paul in. So I'll let Dave introduce himself.
Yes.
Because it can become obvious once they introduce themselves. But yes, there is an opportunity through what these guys do that feeds into the evidence base that we then use.
Welcome.
Dave Mee from Public Realm. I'm as lead on the green space, open space element, and Paul Ramsgill, Community Sports Development Manager, leads on the sports based elements. I think there's a general introductory comment. There's a table in the document which is under the sports element, page 17, Whilst it's published under the sports element, that covers open space and various categories of open space. And putting aside sort of like that's the dry starting point, it is the dry starting point, and it's been approved by council or the planning committee. So as officers, that's our first policy starting point. It sets out the various catchments, and York being York and being quite tight and quite built up, it does actually, drive you down particular routes, particular locations to spend money. On top of that, as I'm speaking for Paul here, we both lay our own professional knowledge and networks as to where money could be, beneficially used. And I suspect that I know about half of the councillors around the table, and most of you at different times have been asking me what 106 money is available as well. So I think there is a dialogue, maybe not published, maybe not formalised, but there is a dialogue for member local knowledge. I think the phrase you're using, what's coming up from the wards or the parishes. So whilst we don't have a formal process, it does start from a formal process to an informal one, and we make those sort of spending choices. I hope that maybe clarifies a few points, and then if there's anything specific, obviously please come back.
John, to add anything, Paul?
No, not unless there's something more specific than Dave's.
Okay. If you stay at the table in case somebody, did you want to come back on that, Councillor?
Just very briefly, I think you're right, Dave, that does work really well, but I think one of the problems is it tends to happen post 106, which is one of the issues that's being raised by members of the public, that lacks a bit of that transparency when the 106 is agreed, and then there's a period of precisely what you said, and it probably does get to the right decision in the end, but for members of the public, it does seem as though that money goes and then appears somewhere else, and doesn't allow for that level of transparency. So what we're suggesting is any way you can do it before it gets to 106 would be better, but I'm not entirely sure about that. And then my second point was about the table, and I hope Joey's problem with this, and I think again it's about the local chat, Paul, all about this being so that's very distance driven. Whether that pitch is actually of any use is a completely different matter. So you can be within 1.15 hectares of a football pitch, but if that football pitch for 30 weeks of the year is under 6 inches of water, then you're nowhere near a football pitch that's actually usable. So that sort of nuance of it doesn't sort of feed in to say, well, actually, yeah, maybe it is outside of this table. It's a long time. Jesus, well, going back 10 years, I think, since we reviewed this. I was part of the committee that wrote this particular paper. Maybe there is further documentation everywhere that actually says, is it fit for purpose? But we do need a mechanism in it that actually says, you know what, that pitch is rubbish. It couldn't take any more usage yet. It's within the distance, but it's not fit for purpose.
We'll do that first, because you've got the pitch strategy.
So you may be aware that whenever I comment on applications, I always comment against a draft playing pitch strategy, particularly because the planned applications at the moment only really cover those open spaces or those sports element of open spaces. So it could be used as an example for changing rooms within a building, but couldn't be used for badminton courts as an example, because that would be an indoor sport. But hopefully will be included when we get to community infrastructure levy and can use those funds on indoors.
That's your first point. One of the problems I have in using the money is the unpredictability at times of when the money is paid, because the planning committee may grant approval and then the developer's got 3 years to start that development. And then you may have a trigger point of so many properties built before they make a payment. So because we do regularly have several years pass before that money is actually paid. So I'd be reluctant to commit too early to something that may be needed in like 2024 when we don't get the money till 2030.
Good. Thank you. We'll come on to the spending of the money in a bit, in a moment. I'll just go around and pick up the other hands that I had. So, James?
I was just going to say, section 106 can be used to, so the classic one, I believe we've done it in York, Paul may tell me differently, but I've certainly done it elsewhere, is where you use section 106 to improve an existing facility. So the classic one is to drain a football pitch, so that actually you can play more matches on it in a week than you could otherwise. So you can improve existing facilities as well as create new.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Waller.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two questions. First one relates to open space. And it's really making the point that you can't create open space where it doesn't exist. And that is an increasing problem in the built up area within the city. And it needs to be flat if it's going to be very useful. And some of the open spaces in certainly the Westfield area, for York, it's rather hilly. So what I'm saying is, how are you applying this so that the benefit is felt by the community that's having the development? Because the danger is you end up with a situation that it's some distance, and then that disconnect doesn't help the debate with the community about having development take place.
If one of the 3 points that the 106 requires is that it says it must be necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms directly related to the development. So anything that we request has to be directly relatable. We can't ask for something that doesn't relate. So that's how we would tie it in.
Well, I think it was raising that in terms of the wider planning process rather than just 106. But in terms of where there is a condition placed on, for instance, for education, there's a trigger point that the schools have to demonstrate that their classrooms are filled up because of this development. Therefore, there's this interplay between the planning committee making a decision about we're expecting a contribution to education of X, but that isn't actually delivered until the pressure is felt in a local school. So it's how does your software reflect this and demonstrate that the maximum amount of benefit in education contribution from a development is actually coming through the system, because it may be some years before that's fully realised.
Part of the 106s is to have trigger points, because that's when the pressure will be felt. So for example, if you've got 150 houses, there may be a trigger at 50, 100 and then 150. And that will be directly relatable to when, for example, they pay part of the education contribution. They will eventually get to the full sum, but usually what will happen is there will be X amount at 50, X amount at 100, and then the full amount will have been paid by the time they get to 150. That's why we have officers that monitor 106s. Sorry, a officer that monitors 106s to check when they're being built, to then check that we're getting the contributions that can then get spent.
If I can just follow up, is how would we see this in the paperwork, that in the annual report that comes forward, so that we're aware that it will change year on year, but someone is making sure, as you've described, that at the appropriate points that money is being transferred.
So we have a new system in place that has these triggers in it that will allow us to track when the money is due. And then obviously the officer has to go and check out on site whether or not they've been built. Yeah. And then obviously you've got your infrastructure funding statement that you've got as your annex that then reports on what we've received and what we've spent. So it's all in there.
And we might sort of discuss, I know when we had a chat before this meeting, we were talking about that sort of back office system, and how that, I'm not suggesting all members should be given access to that, but where members had a particular query about the pace at which contributions have been received and been invested, whether there'll be an opportunity for members to ask the question, whilst obviously not overwhelming the member of staff who is responsible for operating that system. But that's maybe something we can pick up on. So I've got a couple more hands. So we're just focusing at this point on kind of the identification of need and how that evidence base is used. I've got Councillor Rowley and then Councillor Merritt. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Again, it kind of follows on for a number of the topics that have been mentioned. So I accept that the answers to my questions may well have been covered in the 106 training, which unfortunately I wasn't able to attend due to work commitments. So there's lots of figures, there's lots of tables and lots of bits of money, which are not, you know, insignificant by any stretch of the imagination. So very quickly, if I can refer you to page 30 of the report, page 9 of the annex, and it talks about amounts of contributions that are held, it's £10.3 million of funds that are held. So I have a couple of questions, but they are all linked. So that isn't money that's been secured. That is 106 money that we are holding in a bank account somewhere.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Okay, and then the graphs below that on page 31 of the report, which again are very informative. I just want to understand that the amounts that are secured, they would be the amounts that were included in the previous graph of the total. So this is so Paul, you're shaking your head there. Can you see where the confusion for me starts to? So those amounts in those following graphs don't pertain to that totals graph above. So I'm sorry, on page 32, 31, 32, there's charts there that tell us what's been secured, incidentally, what ward, what application, and what the intended use is. So that isn't money that's in those pots. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I have one final question that is related to this, Chair, and then I'll keep my light off.
That's fine.
Good evening, everybody. Mark Baldry, Principal Development Management Officer. In terms of the tables and things that are covered within Annex 1, so the contributions held at the start of the reported year is a summary of, I think you referenced sort of, if you imagine it as sort of a you know, money sat in a bank account. So they're points where the Section 106 agreements that have been agreed previously have hit their trigger points. So the developer has gone and paid the obligations that were due. The contributions secured during the reported year is an overview and summary of the Section 106 agreements that have been agreed and signed within that 12-month period covered by the IFS. So they are potentially things that you will have seen come before a planning committee. They are potentially, or, you know, conceivably, if something goes to a planning committee, receives a resolution to grant planning permission subject to a 106, there can be a bit of a lag time between that resolution and the Section 106 being agreed. But it's sort of, that is a summary of what has been secured within that reported year. In practice, that amount probably wouldn't necessarily come forward as that amount, because when you factor in other clauses and things within the Section 106 agreement, such as indexation, to sort of adjust those amounts, those values will change. Those values won't be the values when they reach their trigger points, if that makes.
Okay, it does. And then, thank you, Chair. But just my final kind of question point, really, because you provided some brilliant answers. Thank you. And I know an awful lot more about 106 now than I did half an hour ago. But so whilst those payments are made very often in stages, the final contribution of 106 is kind of paid when the final bricks laid or whatever, when the project's complete, the last bit of 106. So then we know that money's come in. In terms of a planning application that's had approval and a commitment to 106 has been received, and although the money hasn't been received, the commitment for that money is agreed. Should that development or that application not proceed for whatever reason, are you confident that no money will have been? Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if a development doesn't go ahead, from my interpretation of what you've said, it's quite likely that if it's a greenfield site, nothing goes ahead. But as part of the 106 agreement, we'd agreed X, Y, and Z in terms of funding to be paid over a period. If that development doesn't go ahead in its entirety, if it just falls by the wayside, then nothing's been received, and therefore nothing gets paid back. But it would obviously then fall off the tables that we've got in terms of. Am I right in that understanding?
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
So we could secure something.
Yeah.
But if that development doesn't proceed, we might not necessarily receive those obligations because the specified trigger points haven't been reached. But conversely, if that development didn't proceed, there wouldn't be the need to offset the impact from that development by virtue of the obligations that have secured. So,
and definitely finally, so the recipients of the intended 106 funding, because in the tables there are recipients that are not local authorities. So there's sports clubs, there's all kinds. Are they aware of the potential funding that they may be receiving, or is that a kind of closed book earmarking? I'm just thinking that third parties, okay, we're straying out about it, but third parties could plan their business based on the assumption that they're going to receive funds which they may not receive. And I'll be quiet now,
No, they could, but it has to be caveated that it does rely on the development coming forward, and they would know that.
Did you, Councillor Eyre, did you have a supplementary? No. Okay. Okay, Councillor Merritt.
Whilst we're looking at the actual numbers, I'd just like to clarify something. The starting figure and the ending figure, it says contributions held, which I'd assumed was the actual monies that have been paid to the council. But if you actually look at the numbers, it appears to be that the year-end figure is the beginning of year figure plus the contributions secured, which is a promissory note rather than actual money, plus the money actually received in the year, less the money spent in the year. So when it says contributions held, that's not actually correct, is it?
You're going to have to explain that again, because I don't think either of us got that.
Try again, Councillor.
If you look at the sums of money, you started the year with supposedly 9.3 million held, and you ended the year with 10.3 million held. That's a million increase. But if you actually look at the three change tables, contributions secured during the reported year, which is the promise of payments, so that's not actually real money. Then you've got over the page the actual money received, which is 0.3 million, and then the contributions spent in the year, which was 500,000, just over. So actually the change in the money held, it was a negative figure, 200,000-ish. But you're actually showing that the contributions held at the end of the year is 1 million more. And that can only be achieved if you take into account the money, the 1.2 million promised. So our contributions, well, I'm assuming contributions held therefore is a combination of money and promise. Is it?
Is it the inflation applied to the money held? Has that led it to increase in value? I don't know.
There's index linking as part of the, and interest link. So there would be interest as part of this.
Which is, so there's missing figures that.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
I suppose it'd be helpful to, see how it gets from one figure to another.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think it's a valid point, I think, in terms of.
Yes, well, whatever it is, I'd like to know. And if, if we are
perfect.
trying to look at a full picture, we ought to be looking at the full picture, not
it's
selected bits.
It's a perfectly valid point.
Yeah. The other issue in terms of the numbers I wanted to ask about is, as was flagged in the member briefing earlier, obviously some expenditure commitments aren't committed, and there are clawback arrangements in some of the Section 106 agreements. Can I ask what monies this last year were clawed back? If any?
Do you mean? Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean clawed back by where we haven't spent the money and we've had to give it back? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I'd say again. I don't think we have given it. I don't know for certain. I'd have to go away and find out, but I don't think we have given any, but I will find out.
Thank you.
It'd be helpful to have that.
If I could also ask, we were talking earlier about staged payments. Now, obviously, if you stage large payments partway through a development, that may be a challenge for the developer in terms of his funding arrangements, but it also may, from our point of view, mean development gets held up. And I can think of some examples, not a million miles away from here, where that apparently is the position at the moment on a partly built development. How do officers plan and negotiate the staging to try and ensure that does not occur? Do you have a model for evaluating the risk of, in effect, allowing a development to stall partway through because of the size of the payments that become due? How do you choose it's one big payment halfway through as opposed to two or three partway through?
It will depend on the size of the development and negotiations with the developer and the evidence of the ask. So say, for example, from education colleagues, they may ask for specific points when they think that triggers will be hit. So it's a number of factors how we will work it out. There isn't one specific. We have to take into account different things to then work it out for each specific site.
Thank you. Councillor Orrell.
Thank you, Chair. If an application is refused and then allowed on appeal, how is the 106 agreement worked in that situation?
It's done through the appeal process, as part of the, in this case, I'm imagining a public inquiry would have been held, and any conditions and 106 requirements will have been negotiated through that process that the inspector will then have to consider as part of his decision.
So the inspector decides?
It'll be based on the evidence that we've provided as part of the process, part of the public inquiry process. They will decide based on the recommendations and work that we've done with the developer.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. So just to follow up on Councillor Merritt's final question. So if a developer midway through their build out comes to us and says, we can't quite do this bit and that bit of the 106 agreement, how does that play out? I'm sure planning authority would ask for evidence and then try and be, I don't know, work in partnership and be collegiate, but at some point, I'm guessing we have to say these agreements exist for a reason. How do we manage that between playing hardball and trying to work with developers in a way that doesn't just give them a possible blank check to just sort of waive the responsibilities 5 or 10 years down the line.
They can come in and ask to vary the
Yeah.
106, but it would have to be based on evidence. So say if they're telling us that they can't afford a contribution of some type, if they came to us and asked to vary the 106, we would expect a viability assessment that formed part of it which we then have independently assessed, that would look at whether or not it was viable. It isn't. It is 100% not that we will agree that. It has to be based on the evidence.
Yeah.
So if they could provide evidence that suggested something wasn't viable, would there be a circumstance where we would effectively say, well, tough luck. It's your problem to solve, and we're not going to let you continue building this thing that will make you some money if you're not now able to do the nicer mitigation elements.
You'd have to look at it on a case by case basis and see what the implications were of the contribution not moving forward and how far they were along in the development, depending on the scale of the change. Well, if they're making that kind of significant change to 106, it'd need to come back to planning committee to consider.
Right.
So yes, we would rigorously look at that.
I guess that would be the ultimate, I suppose, backstop if a planning application being approved because of the harms the development would cause are outweighed by benefits, and then if the benefits disappear, how would you make the judgment as to, because the Section 106 contributions are either scaled back or removed altogether, what's the tipping point for it to be referred back to committee?
It would depend on the level of renegotiation. Sometimes we can get deed of variations just for a change to a plan. That wouldn't necessarily come back to committee. If they're changing the type of affordable housing, but your percentage remains the same, we wouldn't necessarily bring that back to committee. But if you were changing from 30% to none, we would bring that back to committee because that's a principal issue. It's the level of change that we would then look at and make an assessment.
Thank you. I think Councillor Eyre indicated, and then I'll ask for any questions or comments on how the money is spent. Councillor Eyre?
Just a minor point. There's no reference anywhere in the document to health. One of the biggest infrastructure needs we have in the city is primary care. Primary care assessments that we've had coming through show that all of the existing primary care facilities we have are pretty much running at about 130, 140% of their capacity. So generally quite easy to evidence the need of that one. Historically, we've been very poor at that. More recently, Cotmanthorpe, I think, was the first one that we got wise to and did that. We've been intermittently hit and miss, but I think that needs to be in here, and it needs to be something that we are rigorously chasing. It is difficult because it is only a 50% contribution, and health service do need to do that. But I know through the ICP, the Integrated Care Partnership, there is a huge need for infrastructure investment. The NHS is really struggling to find their capital investment plans of that. So the most we can get out of this, from our perspective, will be absolutely crucial.
The reason it isn't in this report is because we were specifically asked to focus on open space and recreation. There's no reference to education or highways or anything else in there. We went with what we were specifically asked to, but we are working with colleagues in public health and the NHS on requests going forward. We've met with them, we continue to meet with them. It is a priority. We are aware of it. We just haven't focused on it specifically on this.
Thank you. James, did you want?
I was just going to reiterate what Becky just said. We actually had a meeting with health colleagues today about how they can strengthen their evidence base. So it's a bit of work with us to get what it is you need. So that meeting, there's a meeting on it today as it happens. Yeah.
Did they have about 30 million in cash with them as well, to meet their side of it? Because at the moment it seemed that we were getting all the money from 106 and they had zero.
Councillor Pavlovic, did you want to add anything?
Just to emphasise the point that health are now much more actively engaged with the planning department and the ICS colleagues are now contributing as a statutory consultee anyway about the strategic needs of health needs of a new development. So, you know, it's very much you pointed out a gap in the system in previous years, and that gap's now being filled, and as the same with our public health colleagues that work within the authority. So we're working with all statutory consultees about identifying how an area is going to adapt as it grows.
Thank you. Before I move on to community infrastructure levy, I just wanted to touch on, we've got the money in, triggers have been hit, money's been received, the process of the spending the money, which from Becky, from your perspective, you've done, you know, your job at that point is to monitor the spend, but it'd be helpful to understand from officers what the so the barriers are to actually spending the money, so that the either the school places are provided or the open space is improved, expanded. What are the key issues that can hinder that, or does it work as well as it can do? It'd just be helpful because it's something that is raised, you know, rightly or wrongly by residents and often by sort of potential named beneficiaries in terms of, you know, where's our 106 money? Be helpful to understand what some of the sort of delivery sort of challenges are in terms of, you know, I suppose you want to keep the money held in the bank as low as possible, because hopefully most of it will be out of the account and on the ground.
So I suppose I can wear two hats on this, both as a responsible for planning and responsible for projects. So I think as a starting point, it's probably if Becky talks you through how the process works from a control point of view, and then we can perhaps get into some of the challenges around delivery as well.
Yeah.
So when we receive the money, finance colleagues let us know. We have a system in place that we monitor that in. We also have a pro forma that we send out to the relevant department that says this is what the 106 specifically said you needed to spend this money on. And they send that back in the agreement that says, yes, we know that this is what it's got to be spent on. Once they've agreed to that, we will then release the money that we know that it's going to be spent on what was agreed on as part of the 106. They then will have the money released and can go and spend it on what they've agreed that it was going to be spent on. Once they've spent it, they then have to come back to us to confirm what the money has been spent on. So we then have the audit trail and we have it in our system to know that we've released it and then it's been spent on X, Y, and Z. So we have an audit trail in place to allow us to track and record what the money has been spent on. We obviously then have the system that records that information when we've received it, how much we've received as well. And then that's up to the individual service area to spend it on specifically what has been agreed as part of the 106. It's important at that point to say that it can only be spent on what has been agreed in the legal agreement. It can't be changed to be something else.
Yeah. Councillor Merritt.
That obviously accounts for the money. How do we monitor that we're delivering what we said? So for instance, we get quite a lot of money in for travel plans. You know, how many of those travel plans are in place and operating? You know, the agreement normally requires review mechanisms as well. So how well are those plans delivering? Have they been reviewed on schedule? Have they been strengthened where they've not been working? How is that sort of stuff monitored?
That's done by the individual service area. We have a travel plan coordinators that work within our highways team that look and make sure they're working correctly as part of that. And it's more a review on a case by case basis that they are working as they should. But highways colleagues will do that.
Those teams often get involved in the actual drafting of the travel plans in the first place. So the officers will get involved in approving those travel plans and then get involved in the review process.
So where is that information available for us to monitor?
I think it'd be on a case by case basis is probably the reality.
Yeah. How many schemes do you now have?
I couldn't tell you that off the top of my head.
In terms of travel plan,
Yes.
Okay.
Just, you know, it's an area of interest to me. You know, it was a fundamental mechanism for delivering lower car use, increased active travel, and so on. And, you know, we have travel plans going back 25, 30 years. You know, where is the monitoring of that? Where is the reporting of that?
okay, no, it's an interesting point, because one says, does it hinge on what the 106 required? Did he just require some say, here's a travel plan, stick it on a shelf and and do nothing with it, or subject to regular review? I suppose what's the
most of the travel plans, not necessarily the earliest ones, but the later ones, required periodic reviews to demonstrate that those travel plans were delivering what they set out to do, and if they weren't, to look to additional measures to achieve the original objectives of those plans. So, you know, they're quite a powerful mechanism potentially for achieving the council's transport objectives. And they just seem to have disappeared as far as any reporting or other process.
I don't think they've disappeared. They're still, the travel plan are still secured as part of the 106. There's still monitoring for travel plans as part of 106s. That sits within the highway section, and there is a requirement that they look at those as part of the 106. So it is being done. It's not reported in an infrastructure funding statement because it's not a contribution per se. It's a requirement.
okay? Yeah, Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you, Chair. I think you make a really valid point, but the question I would then throw back is, yes, perhaps we need better joined up working, but is the planning department the right people to be monitoring it? Because, you know, essentially they are planners. They will respond to consultation with experts in those different fields. And once the discharge of a Section 106 has been done, it's not, and I think Councillor Fenton sort of referenced it, does it sit on a shelf? You know, I don't think it's the job of an individual planner or even the head of planning to say, well, that was a really good transport plan, or that was a terrible transport plan. That's got to sit with the departments. And if there's one overall, you know, if there's one controlling mind over it, that's assessing whether it's successful or not, that's a different matter. But, you know, it's a relatively small planning department that is trying to deliver a great deal for a very limited amount of capacity. And so I think, you know, the legal requirement is for them to administer the 106, for them to ensure that that money is discharged to the relevant department, and then to feed into the finance department to say that that money has been spent and has been received. I kind of think if you're then trying to add more and more things onto their, then planning applications will get slower and slower and slower because there's nobody to oversee that type of process. And I'm just being brutally realistic.
No, I think it's kind of understanding how it works, not necessarily then making the leap to say, well, your team should therefore take on that responsibility. Councillor Merritt.
Yeah, I accept that there probably needs to be some better reporting mechanism, and we can certainly
Yeah.
look into seeing how best to be able to look at the discharge of 106 conditions and how that's then fed into a system that is transparent and available to members and members of the public, frankly.
Councillor Merritt.
Yes, I'm not necessarily expecting planning officers to necessarily do half of these things, but you know, we're a corporate services committee. We are interested in the corporate results from this process, and simply knowing that we've spent the money doesn't actually answer all that questions in terms of what we've been trying to achieve through section 106s. And the same, you know, similar questions I think can be asked in other areas. You know, we are developments, we secure monies for play equipment and other sorts of things which are meant to enhance the capacity of those facilities to cater for additional development. But if you go and look in certain play areas where we have spent section 106 monies many times over the years, actually have we enhanced the increased capacity, or have we simply replaced existing equipment? You know, where is the monitoring that we have actually increased capacity in a genuine way? So there's, you know, lots of questions that could be asked about the different areas to see, are we actually properly delivering what this is meant to be? It's not simply an issue of spending the money.
And I'm not I'm not disagreeing with your basic premise, and it's something that if the committee wants us to explore further, how best we can do that, then you know, happy to look into that for you.
Thank you. In terms of, does anyone have any, before we move on to community infrastructure levy, anyone have any further questions on the broad range of 106 issues? No. Okay. Community infrastructure levy. Councillor Healy.
I need to be gone by 7, given the fact you're starting a new topic. Is it okay?
It's a subtopic, really.
Subtopic.
Yes. Sorry.
Apologies, Chair. I did have one more question about the section 106.
Yeah.
Under the arrangements, we are allowed to secure contributions for monitoring of section 106 agreements as part of the section 106 agreements. But the papers indicate that we haven't actually done that in section 106 agreements. Given the pressure the authority is under in terms of its budgets, should we not be doing that, at least in future?
We have. It's just not in the last reported year. Have we received any that's been secured? So yes, we do ask. If you've seen any of the recent sites that have come to committee, they've all had a request of it, if it's been viable. It's just that we didn't receive any for it last year.
Community infrastructure levy. Quick question from me. In terms of the paragraph 27 sets out the mechanisms where there's an adopted neighbourhood plan, 25% of the SIL monies are collected are payable to the community. I'm guessing that means to a parish council or some other entity that's approved a neighbourhood plan. And for areas where there is no neighbourhood plan, and I'm guessing that also equates to there being no parish council, then 15% will be made available to the community following consultation between the local authority and the community in some way, shape or form. Is there something underpinning that in terms of how that will work in practice, or is that something that will be developed and fine-tuned just from looking at it from members will look at it from different perspectives, whether you're in a parished area or an unparished area. Do we have more of a sense of how that will actually work?
Just to apologise, the the team who wrote this part of the new are leading on SIL, there's nobody here tonight from them, so I may have to defer some of the questions to them, but the percentages, as far as I'm aware, is set within the SIL regs. So that's not, it's not negotiable through.
Yeah.
It is set within, it's set there, so it's not something that we can negotiate here.
No, I wasn't querying
Sorry.
the numbers, it was more the process, but I appreciate if Catherine Daly.
Yes.
I thought was on our list.
Yes,
She
yeah,
was on our list to
unfortunately.
attend.
I mean, I can answer it as best as I can.
Have a go.
But yes, in short, if there's an adopted neighbourhood plan, they do get to go within the 25%. But if not, where there's no neighbourhood plan, that's where it falls to within the 15%. But that's still negotiated with the local authority and ward members rather than a parish council. So it is still negotiated with. It's not the council itself doesn't just make the decision. We will negotiate with ward members as part of that process.
Okay. I'm just trying to. We could probably have another discussion at some other time about the mechanics of that in terms of how the difference between allocation of money to a parish council and a negotiation with ward members. I think it'd be interesting to discuss that in a bit more detail as to how it will work. Councillor Waller?
I think it'd be fair to say that when the government consulted on this process, we did, as an authority, respond to point out these very problems. They're there as a result of government not actually listening to their consultation process.
Yeah, this isn't a scheme we've designed. It's more really trying to make sure that in its implementation, we try and give everyone. We don't inadvertently disadvantage any parts of the city. But I appreciate it's not your policy area, Becky, so I wouldn't know. Don't want to put you on the spot. Do members have any observations they'd like to make? Councillor Baxter.
I'm not sure if it's SIL or more 106, but if the city wanted something like a skate park or a general big project, how does it work in taking the money from 106 from different wards and putting it together? Is that something that can be done?
So as a facility that will be used by people across the city. Yeah.
So in the context of that question, within Section 106 agreements, the spend has to be defined for it to be meet the tests of being required as part of the granting of that planning permission. SIL, on the other hand, is more flexible in the sense that as part of setting out the SIL strategy, the SIL charging schedule, you can then also look at defining the types of infrastructure that, as an authority, we would want to spend those SIL monies on. Things like, taking your example, a skate park could be included in that, and it's a far more, in comparison to a Section 106 agreement, SIL regime is more flexible in that respect, and you can look at citywide type infrastructure or projects or whatever it may be.
Okay. Councillor Merritt.
Flexibility obviously does give considerable options, but are we going to prepare some framework for how we will actually look to allocate these SIL monies in future? These could be quite substantial over a period of time. Sorry, the non-ward bit, in effect, the bulk of the money, which it comes in effect for citywide measures. Or does it not? I mean, that's one of the things I'm not 100% clear. Section 106s are clear. It has to specifically relate to the existing development. I'm assuming that doesn't apply if the SIL money is for citywide measures.
Who would like to have a go at that?
While they're discussing, so the answer is yes, there will be a charging schedule that's prepared, and Becky will correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is there's a sort of inquiry process that sits behind that as well. So yes, that charging schedule is prepared.
No, I've read it, James. I don't think it answers my question. Is about what we do when the money comes in and how we spend it.
Patrick Looker, maybe.
Patrick Looker, Head of Service Finance. So it will be the executive who determine how the SIL is utilised. So the council will adopt an infrastructure plan. It will determine its priorities for that infrastructure that it will develop. So the money that is at the city council's responsibility will ultimately be an executive decision. We'll add it into the capital programme. We'll show the SIL as a source of funding, and it will be for them to prioritise how that, which bit of infrastructure is required in which particular order. It's very much a member decision, and the executive's the most obvious, the correct decision-making body for that purpose.
Yep. Okay.
If there is going to be that sort of infrastructure plan, has work started on it, and when might we see that and perhaps do some pre-scrutiny on?
Yeah, I think as part of the local plan, we had to identify what infrastructure would be required, and so there's schedules within the local plan framework. So that's slightly beyond my remit.
The schedule is there, the prioritisation and choice making isn't.
I'm not aware of how far that's gone through.
I don't know that either, I'm afraid.
Okay, we can pick that up maybe. Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. Something I'm curious about, and it might be a non-issue, and I hope it is the sort of, or perhaps a sort of unintended relationship between 106 money and SIL money. Now, fully appreciate 106 much more prescribed. There's a process to go through with that. SIL seems more open to play with, for want of a better phrase. But from a developer's perspective, there's no more sort of, they'll still be making the same money from a development. It'll still cost them the same amount of cash. So I guess what I'm getting at is, does the existence of a SIL in other areas, because I'm guessing other parts of the country have a SIL up and running now, does that see any sort of weird sort of downward pressure on 106 and any gains that might come from that, or how reliable trigger points are delivered on? It's difficult to articulate, but if a developer knows before 106 and SIL conversations begin that they're going to make, I don't know, 100k off something, pre-SIL, there's 100k there and there's one contribution to give something towards, but post-SIL there's now two pots of money, and I'm guessing that will lead to more conversations about viability. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, very much so.
So it's easy to get excited by the fact that this SIL exists, but will it actually leave us that much better off, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Hopefully it will. The 106, I don't think of the best way to put it. The SIL is it's a levy and it's not negotiable. So they do that. You can't argue the same way in terms of whether or not you pay it. It is a levy on development, whereas 106 is negotiable. So, but things such as affordable housing won't be covered in SIL. That will be still subject to a Section 106 agreement and potentially viability. But the strategic sites, they won't be covered by SIL. They will all they've already been looked at and been through a process to look and see how those contributions will work. So your SIL will be for your windfall sites, and anything, I think it's 4 and above units, that's not a strategic site.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
But there'll be 106 will still be up for grabs for non-strategic sites, and SIL will also apply to them. So I think what I'm trying to say is, if a developer knows that they're going to have to pay SIL and also possibly 106, depending on the type of development, they're gonna play that viability card a lot more aggressively than what they already do, which is quite a lot in many cases, right? Am I just overthinking this? I mean, I'm hearing you making, I won't call them grunts, they're noises of broad. Yeah, yeah. It'd be interesting to know what you think as well, but you know.
Potentially, what usually happens is you get a race to submit applications before SIL is implemented. At previous authority where I worked, that happened. The applications were submitted just before SIL was implemented to try and avoid that. So yes, it'd be remiss of me not to say that could happen. But ultimately, through the SIL, you will get the contributions that you're seeking, and there will also be the 106 for the specifics. So say, for example, a highway is specific, but a TRO would still come under a 106 as well. So there will still be the ways of securing what you wanting to secure. It just does it in a slightly different way that gives more flexibility.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'll draw this agenda item to a close. In terms of some of the points I've noted down, so in terms of further information requested, something about figures on any money that has been clawed back. In terms of 106, a sort of better understanding of how we got to the 10.3 million figure, whether it's sort of indexation, just if we could have an explanation on that.
Sorry, Chair, can I?
Yes.
So the 10.3 figure is money that's in the bank. What wasn't included in the infrastructure statement, and I probably need to check why it wasn't included in that, is the council actually pays, they're not section 106s because the council can't pay section 106s contributions to itself. So a number of the housing development sites at Burnholme and Duncombe made contributions into the 10.3 million, but aren't included in the infrastructure statement because they're not a section 106 agreement, because we can't have an agreement with ourselves. So it was 9.3, we added 1.3, there was a small amount of interest added onto it as well, less what we had spent, and we have figures which justify that, which balance to our accounts as well.
No, that's helpful. Thank you for that. We talked about.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chair. Sorry,
Yes.
sorry, don't mean to interrupt. As far as I'm aware, there were no repayments last financial year for any section 106s. I certainly can't recall anything that was paid back last financial year. There had been one or two over the years, but they've all been relatively minor.
Thank you. We talked about travel plan monitoring, but that's, I suppose it's something we can sort of consider sort of separately. I don't think it's something that we can realistically ask Becky to take away, but I think it was a point worth raising in terms of whether those items are delivering the outputs that were expected at the time. Councillor Merritt.
It was perhaps a mistake on focusing on one particular thing, but as I say, I think there's a wider accountability that needs to be required in terms of what's delivered for the money that we need to see. And obviously, I think we need to see slightly different accounting, so that when we get the IFS statement, we do have a statement that actually covers all the bases. I do wonder, you know, we've had a lot of questions today. I think there are issues that might be worth a task group looking at in more detail around some of those, get the answers. And, you know, I think there are some recommendations we ought to be making to try and improve transparency and accountability on some of these issues. So I'd like to make that as a suggestion.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot to look at in terms of, you know, there are some good things happening in terms of sort of intelligence gathering. Obviously, the sense I get from members is they'd like as much as that to be done as possible before Section 106 agreements are made, so that all relevant information is gathered. And obviously, there is a good back office system that is being used by officers to monitor every stage in the process. That's not to say that, as you point out, Councillor Murray, there aren't opportunities for further improvement and just testing that the monies that have been secured are delivering the benefits that were envisaged. So I'd be, if there's enthusiasm amongst members to for a small group to go away and do some more thinking about that with the view to, you know, having a positive impact in terms of identifying potential improvements could be made to the system. I'm sure that would be I'd certainly be supportive of that. I'm not going to ask for volunteers now, but if you'd be happy to have a think about potential sort of realistic aims and objectives for such a task and finish group, and very much member led, obviously, and circulate something around, we can maybe recruit some volunteers for that. Okay, does anyone else have any other points they want to raise? If not, so yes, we have a 5-minute break before we move on to the next item. But thank you, officers, for your contribution and for answering all of our many and varied questions. Okay, welcome back. We'll now move on to agenda item 6, which is a report on the digital switchover 2025. This report follows on from a motion to full council late last year in relation to the switching off of the analog network. We're joined by officers who will be presenting the report and answering any questions we might have. So if I can ask you to introduce yourselves, please.
Okay, I'm Roy Grant, Head of ICT Services.
Hi, I'm Sandy Annals, Business Manager for Be Independent.
And I'm Vicky Japes, Head of Housing Strategy and Performance.
Thank you very much for coming. So thank you for the report, which which I'm sure members have all read. If you'd like to briefly introduce the report, please.
Yeah, will do. Thanks, Chair. As you mentioned, it follows on from the full council motion, and picking up the key points of it, it's December 2025 when the switchover is due to be complete. That timeline may slip. So at the moment, we're in an early discovery gathering phase where we're actually working with a number of service colleagues, and two of the key ones are here tonight, so you can pick up on housing and Be Independent. So we get a full picture across the council of the work programme that's required between now and the end of December 2025. There isn't a one-size-fits-all to this. There'll be a number of services which won't be impacted. There'll be a number of services that will be impacted, but different levels. So at the moment, we're just going around working with colleagues across the council to get a full picture of the work that's required to address the switchover challenge between now and the end of December. So we can bring further reports or updates to you as the work progresses, and we are looking to widen the campaign of awareness communication, working with existing channels and partners, but also to start to work with other organisations so we get actually a city view of how we're going to be positioned as we head towards the end of December 2025.
Thank you very much. So I shall invite members to ask any questions or raise any comments on the content of the report. I'll begin with Councillor Steels-Walshaw.
There's a couple of things, but it's kind of around the same question. So I just wondered if there was anything being done to identify people who are specifically affected, because it kind of suggests that people who, and I think this is the second part of the question, so many people are not aware that this is happening, and all the stuff about it happening is on social media, but the people who aren't aware of it happening are probably the people who are less likely to be on social media. And you said you were working with some companies around it, and I just really like to know.
Would it help if Sandy and Vicky to give some examples of the work we're doing in communicating direct to residents who take services from us as a council, who rely on these digital connectivity links, and then I'll pick up the wider communications second.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. So from Be Independent's perspective, we have approximately 2,300 customers who receive our Telecare Lifeline device service. And at the moment, we have been swapping out some of these devices from the analog devices that are currently in people's homes to the digital devices, because they've already gone through the digital switchover with their telecoms providers. So whilst we've done approximately 400 today, we still have another 1,900 to do. And just in December, we sent a letter out to all our customers in the post, just to give them an overview of, you know, the digital switchover and what that meant to them, just with a, you know, a couple of pictures in as well, just to show, you know, when it's plugged into your phone socket or when it's plugged into your router. And we have received quite a number of inquiries from that, just from people inquiring what's going on to, you know, they have been digitally switched over, and that's when we need to intervene and change their equipment over. We've also been contacted by BT with regard to a data sharing agreement, with regard to all of our customers, as they want to highlight vulnerable customers, York residents, as to how they're going to deal with those customers or leave them till the last point, if you like, before doing the switch out for those customers. So we have been in contact with BT and some other telecom providers.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, right? Yeah.
I was going to pick up your wider point. And so, part of the next steps, I think we need to broaden out the communication awareness. And we've got the digital first group, which is made up of people like Explore and other community groups. So we can actually get a consistent message going out across all the channels. And we can work with our own comms and media team. So to keep repeating the message so it gets out there.
Yeah. Thank you. I've got Councillor Rowley next.
Thanks, Chair. It's a bit of a supplementary, really, and a great question from the Councillor Walsham. But obviously, I know as a business that it's happening. I know as a residential customer that it's happening. There are a lot of consumers out there that possibly aren't aware that it's happening, and you're doing everything in your power to ensure that they do. One of the things that I slightly worry about is that I know that there's going to be a digital switchover because I must get calls from a myriad of people wanting to offer me the very best deals once the switchover happens. I'm just slightly concerned about vulnerable residents who may be getting calls which are A, unsolicited, and B, in terms of the quality of provision. I appreciate that as a local authority, we can't, we can't legislate as to who can and can't approach customers, but do we have a preferred? So as a local authority, do we have the facility to have a preferred list of providers for services so that I can say to my residents, and as members, we can say to our residents, this is their list of preferred or approved providers. I'm just thinking that I'm worried about the vulnerability of some of our residents.
I think we have to be careful when we stray into the territory of seem to be approved certain telco providers. But I think the key thing for us is that as part of that next engagement, we're going to be working with the telecoms industry, who are, as you say, putting out some of their messages through various channels. We've got to make sure that it's consistent. So we know from a York piece, we'll be talking to Virgin Media, we'll be talking to OpenReach, we'll be talking to City Fibres and other providers across our region to make sure we understand their messages and start to key them in. And then I think what was quite key, we need to set up some inbound channels so if people have got any questions, they come to us as an authority, or actually to other partners across York, they get a consistent message from us. So I think that's key part of the next step.
But sorry, Chair, but if there is, if we are entering into, I don't want to say the word agreement, but if we're entering into discussions with providers that we are comfortable with, and you've named a few, would it not be possible to have that list publicly available so that our residents could see that if they are approached by ABC company, that it's a legitimate company, it's a company that are currently working with the City of York. So it's more about not saying yes, that's the company, go for it, but it's protecting those vulnerable, I guess, really.
It is. I think we can help by at least signposting people from our website or from our channels. If they come into us on the phone or email, we can point people to different websites that we know are trusted, well, not trusted, who we're aware of, and they'll be all doing their own awareness campaign anyway. So we'll just make sure that people got a consistent awareness of who to go to.
Was Councillor Wells, was it a supplementary? Yeah.
Yes, it was, Chair.
Yeah.
The letter that you've sent out to residents, I know it's being independent focused, but would it be something that you could share with us so that we can talk to our residents about it?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, obviously we just sent it out to our 2,300 independent customers, just to explain the process really, and we actually made reference there that, you know, we understand that scams may be around the switchover, and not to give out any personal information or financial information over the phone.
Oh, that would be
But just to
useful.
contact us. So yeah, happy to
Yeah.
share it.
Thank you.
Share
Yeah,
it
no,
out.
if you could share it, then we
Yeah.
can make sure all members have got sight of it, because in case we encounter residents who
Yeah.
who asked about it. Did you have a supplementary as well, councillor?
I think it was sort of on that point, we do know that when things like this happen, scammers do deliberately target it. I mean, even to the level when HS2 was first announced, people were straight onto contacting people within the HS. We had to put a lot of literature out to people in the HS2 route saying, don't give your information away to people who claim you entitled to £20,000 compensation from HS2. So yes, getting that information to ward council as quickly as possible so we can get that information out to people. But equally, do we know what the rollout program is? And if that is widely available, then scammers will equally have that information. Can we then start to be alerted to say, well, actually, it's going to happen in this particular area. Let's target our area. Let's get a big campaign saying, don't answer the door to anybody who says, I'm here to do this. Make sure and all that sort of information.
Yeah, that's part of the work we need to be doing with the, you know, I guess with the big three that I just named. They're all active in the York area. So as part of that building programme, we need to see what their rollout is for the switchover, and then work obviously get that from the ISP. So key thing is, councillor, is to get a view of their roadmaps, and we can start sharing that with yourselves, and also update our own website and residents' communication channels. Once we get a firm plan for each of them or all of them, we'll share them at that time.
Because it won't just be financial scamming as well. People will see that as an opportunity to get into people's homes and say, well, actually, I'm here to check on your phone line, ready for the digital switchover. So it will huge levels of risk.
Can I just maybe ask Vicky, is there something similar that either we can do or we have done or are doing in terms of independent living complexes and other potentially sort of vulnerable council tenants?
Yes, so that's, I suppose, that's a bit of the challenge for housing is that obviously in the independent living scheme, every apartment is linked up to be independent. It's part of the offer. So how we get the infrastructure right in those buildings that we are able to continue to provide a good offer to tenants moving in and living in the independent living schemes. And I suppose one of the challenges as well is that we're talking about by December 2025, and that's even without any slippage. But the digital system is reliant on the internet. So if we encourage people to switch now, I mean, as you say, some people are already switched, but if we upgraded an independent living scheme, if we got grant funding available tomorrow and chose to upgrade that scheme, we're then encouraging people to have to be using Wi-Fi, so they'd be having to get their own Wi-Fi in their own apartment, or we would be having to put SIM cards in each box, each telecare box, so that it could talk to the digital system. And in effect, we could potentially be doing that and making people pay for that 2 years before we need to. So it's a real balance. So the roadmap is very important to us to help us plan the funding and to help us make sure that in each scheme people are ready and they understand what's required. So there's a big comms thing behind all of this, and obviously we then have to look at the funding and the delivery program of it all. And it's not just the boxes in flats. We've also got to look at sort of the call alarms in passenger lifts, because a lot of them are analog. So that obviously applies to housing, but will apply to other council and sort of public buildings. And some of our fire alarms as well, any of them that are hardwired to the fire service, we're having to understand the complexities and whether any of them are already digitally enabled.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair, and it's good to have this report here. So I guess another thanks needs to go to Councillor Levies, who put the related motion forward at council just before Christmas, I think. I want to talk about the comms element, and that's been touched on quite a bit already. I think it looks like a lot of work is ongoing or will be done to make residents who use our services aware of the change. And I guess I'm wondering, well, what about the residents who aren't necessarily plugged into services? But will in the future need such services, who might also need to be made aware of this switchover. And it's something I often come back to, and I know we might talk about it in the work plan item, but can we not just get something sent out to every house in the city? Unless we can guess where certain people are living, that just says this is happening, it's a big deal, these are the things you need to think about. I know there's budget implications, but you know, I know the digital first team's been mentioned. And when you said that, I thought, great, but I often worry that digital first can mean digital only. And, you know, there's certain people, and they're not a tiny minority, they're a minority, but they're a sizable minority, I think, in this city, who still need to be communicated with in the old ways. And even if it means repeating a message with an expensive letter, then that's what it'll take. Yeah, is there any thoughts on that? I mean, I know you've offered to share communications with ward councillors, which is great. But there's 47 of us, and we're not all going to get that message out, are we? Let's be honest. Some are more proactive than others. And sometimes I just think doing it properly through the centre is sometimes the best way. And this is a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah, so in terms of picking up, you know, we've got that financial envelope that we're all aware of and working under. As part of that next steps is obviously almost having a comm strategy plan around it, because we're focusing on some of the internal services that face and provide services externally, clearly on the comms. But as I said, I think we've got to then step up and step actually out and do the comms piece across the city. So it will be touch points, like we said, with the extra on the libraries where people do go, and there will be various comms channels. It'll be email, it'll be phone call. It might end up having some form of written communication. You're right. I think they're into one side, it's all with comms. We've got to make sure that message gets out across them all and repeatedly so. So the key part of that next steps is having that comms strategy. So already touched out with comms and media colleagues to build that up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for the answer. Do appreciate it. I'm anticipating difficulty because the council's already cut its our city communication, which I think is a bit underhand, to be honest. I don't think it was ever really put out there that particular thing was going to go. I think it was covered by a broader communications budget title. But I really hope comms do get this and do work with you on it. Yeah, I just worry how that conversation will go. Good communication sometimes costs money, and we've just got to learn to live with it, I think. I also want to say, if you do have any issues with that conversation, feel free to give me a shout, because I'd happily fight your corner, because it's not just your corner, it's the corner of residents out there who aren't always switched on online, and who do sometimes need things repeating to them. That's just the way it is, and we've just got to get with it. Sorry for the rant, but use us if you need to, is what I'm trying to say.
I appreciate it. I wasn't trying to say the digital first group. It's just one channel, one of many.
Vicky?
Just to come back on that, to say it's not quite that dark in terms of our comms. Just to say, housing still send out hard copy. So where we have an email address, we send our newsletter out by email. Many of our customers haven't supplied an email address, so whether they've got one or not is, from our point of view, is irrelevant. If they haven't supplied it, we obviously assume they don't have it. So all of our newsletter goes out in hard copy to anyone we don't have an email address for. And we are putting information into our housing newsletter, and will continue to. So we're sending out a two monthly newsletter. So over the course of the time, we will be making sure all of our housing tenants are aware, and, you know, likely some of our most financially excluded customers, and many of the issues might come to light for us that we can then share with our colleagues. So if our tenants are concerned about it, it's likely that their neighbours are as well, sort of thing. So we are still sending some paper things out.
That's good. Councillor Orrell.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Taylor's absolutely right. There's significant number of people who don't have access to the internet, possibly now because it's becoming too expensive for them. Even those who were signed up to it may not be any longer able to afford it. But there's those people who've never had it and probably never will. And you see various estimates, somewhere between 10% and 20% of people don't have access to that kind of information. And society generally assumes that they do. Government, we do as a council assume that people do have access to the internet. Even the report here, the annexes aren't written. It's a link to them. So if you don't have the internet, you can't read the annexes. But some of the things I was going to ask have been answered, I think. Are BT going to tell us which areas are going to be next? Because one of our councillors, the village he was in, it happened and nobody knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, I think someone made a change at a local exchange and forgot about the communications. So going back to the point on the tail, that's got to come first. So part of that learning experience for us all, Openreach are going to come in and I'm going to talk to them about their programme. I will do the same with Virgin Media and I'll do the same with Openreach and all the other providers. So we get that roadmap from them. It's quite key.
Okay.
Is there any suggestion? I know the sort of digital city team is they're not awash with funding. Is there any scope for the service providers to actually fund some of this awareness raising activity?
That's part of the conversation, Chair. You know, what part you're going to play in helping fund some of the activities required to get the awareness out there. I'm sure all councils and cities and towns will be asking, but we'll get in there. We'll get in first. Like part of the report, some of the preparation work is quite key because there will be a bottleneck, but only the supply chain, be it telecommunications or the other service providers, the closer we get to the end of December 2025. So we're trying to get ahead of some of the other cities.
Thank you. Councillor Burton.
I think some of my questions have partially been answered. Because they're sort of interlinked, really. So I was thinking, because I know being independent is really great service in the city on many levels, and I've used it myself and been very grateful throughout the years. And it doesn't exist in other cities, which is awful. It's something we should be really proud of. I think other providers though do, because I remember ringing my auntie who'd lost her a call thing when she went into hospital and they lost it. So when she came out, I rang you up to get a new one. You were sending one out, but she wasn't with you.
Right.
So you were very helpful until we got to that point. But that was because she calls it the didgeridoo, the internet. I don't have a didgeridoo. And anyway, so and there are so many other, or there are other providers, aren't there?
Yeah.
Are we doing something about that as well?
So there are other telecare providers, out there, and a lot of those are local authorities, you know, up and down the country. Some right at the beginning of the journey. You know, some of them haven't even got a digital platform. A lot of them don't respond, so they just provide the equipment, but they're not actually a response service. Again, they're all it's a similar story really, across the nationally really. When I've been on some of the forums with the other local authorities, they're all in similar situations because there's no specific funding to provide the switchover with regard to telecare equipment.
So the people in York that are with other organisations, they could not know about it because the organisations.
Yeah, if they've got other providers, I would have thought those providers would be, you know, doing something to communicate to their customers about what's happening with their equipment, and the telecoms providers as well. If they're actually switching out the customer putting in digital and they're aware that they've got telecare equipment, they should be signposting them to contact the telecare provider, because to tell them, you know, it will impact the equipment.
But it can be quite boggling, can't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, definitely, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And then the cost, I mean, I know there are social tariffs for internet provision. So people who've just got an analog phone line and now they're going digital, is there an increase in the cost?
Depends on their service provider. I believe BT itself is saying that there is no additional cost with regard to switching to digital. But I couldn't say that for all service telecom providers.
Because I know with the social tariffs, sometimes the speed is slower, and I don't know
Yeah.
whether that would impact on your equipment or not.
No, it's the actual taking it over from moving from analog to digital. We can sort out the making sure that the frequency and the protocols that we use, that as long as it works between the platform and the equipment, that's fine. It's just when there is a power cut, really, that is the point, and that's where SIM cards need to be used, and it needs to be digital equipment there.
So there will but will SIM cards be like as a backup for everyone?
That's correct, yeah.
Right. Oh,
yeah.
very good. Yeah. You sound like you're doing an awful lot to get there already.
Well, we've had to.
Yeah, well, yes.
We've had to move
It doesn't
because
always follow.
yeah,
Thank you.
the telecoms providers are already switching people out, so people have contacted us. So we've had to react to that and change them out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Merritt.
Yeah, it was a follow on from earlier. In terms of the sort of risk of scams, are the council's scam buster team and the environmental protection all involved in your internal group on this?
We're going to bring them into the working group to make sure we can get solid advice and of help with the comms out there. And obviously, if they do get any scam busters, where to signpost people. So yeah, they're in our lens.
Very good. Thank you. Councillor Eyre.
Start with a negative. I've got SIM card backup on my broadband, and it's never worked in the year that I've ever had it. If the broadband goes, it's supposed to whether if the broadband drops, the SIM card kicks in and provides the maintenance, but it's never worked. If the broadband drops, it just drops. It's probably a broader point, and it's very late, and we're not going to solve it tonight. So I just sort of throw it out there as a comment for us to consider going forward. I think what this paper does is give me a level of assurance for those people that we know and those people that we're in contact with. We have plans. What this paper doesn't do, and there's a bit at the beginning that mentioned that this report should involve the NHS funds, etc., etc. I don't think we are anywhere near locating those people that we don't know about, that the most vulnerable group. And we spent a lot of time as a group discussing this when the motion came forward about how we would potentially find those individuals. And I appreciate it is really challenging, but I think that's the bit that's missing from this report. And that's not in any denigration to you, because I don't necessarily have the answers, but it's what we as a corporate body, as councillors, as officers, everything need to think about. It probably is in small numbers, in the small thousands, but we really need to put all our minds at how we work out who those individuals are, how we can get to them the best and the quickest and get that information out. And I think that's probably the key for the next step.
Vicky?
It was just to say there are people aware of that issue, and there are people thinking about it. I've had conversations with members of the Advice York network and things who are saying, you know, if you're sending comms out, can we see it, and can we all share it, and will we be able to send sort of out joint messages, you know, that will be from the council and CAB and all of these people. So yeah, there are people asking the questions and thinking about it, but no one has.
It's one of those challenges we have, especially with the local authority, the NHS, adult social care, everything, that there is a particular generation who are fiercely independent, who've been through an awful lot, and often see approaching the council, approaching NHS as some sort of failure in some sort of level, in terms of the same in finance and everything. They don't take benefits up that they're entitled to because they somehow there's think, well, that's admitting weakness in some way. Those are the sort of people that will never come in contact with us and never come. They're sat at home, incredibly vulnerable, needing a huge amount of support and entitled to a huge amount of support, but sitting there quietly and not putting their hands up. And it's just a huge issue for us to try and get across.
Yes, I think, and it's something I think about in terms of people we all come into contact with who are not council tenants, but are clearly in need, and it's how you make that approach without being being seen as an unwelcome interference in terms of you almost kind of want an invitation to help, but then that's unlikely to come because for those reasons that you set out. But it's something that sure collectively we can think about, and we're fortunate in York to have an array of charitable and voluntary organisations that do an awful lot and have the links into some of those households that as an authority we don't, and it's trying to harness the goodwill and expertise that exists within that that sector as best we can. But no, it's a good point. Anyone have any other comments or questions for Roy, Sandy, or Vicky? I'm guessing this is an issue we will want to return to in terms of obviously seeing how you're getting on. New issues may arise, or the whole thing may be put back or scrapped, who knows. But the sense I get is the government has basically said to the service providers, we're happy for you to crack on and do this with certain kind of checks and safeguards. All we can do is be prepared for it happening by the end of December in 2025, and then be, maybe breathe a sigh of relief if that doesn't happen. But I think we've got no option but to prepare for that as best we can. Thank you for your time, and thanks for the report, and thanks for the work that you're doing to keep us ahead of the game as best you can. Thank you. Okay, we're nearly there. Agenda item 7 is the work plan, which is as presented. A few things to pick up. Combined Authority Constitution. We had our very productive meeting with audit and governance colleagues seems like ages ago. It was only 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? The outputs of which were read out at the inaugural meeting of the Combined Authority by the interim. Sorry? I missed North Yorkshire's contract. Yes, which we should be very proud of. I'm conscious that we didn't cover all of the draft constitution, particularly the finance section. I know some members had lots of comments on that we didn't get an opportunity to discuss. So I would welcome views as to whether there would be support for convening another meeting with audit and governance colleagues to finish the job in terms of picking up any comments on the sections of the draft constitution we weren't able to discuss at our last meeting. Councillor Taylor.
I'm up for it if there's if it can be resourced. And I appreciate why we brought it to an end last time, because it was getting very late, but it would be weird to just like leave a chunk of it, wouldn't it?
Agreed. I think we have to finish it.
Yeah. No, I think that's fine. So if myself and Councillor Merritt liaise with Councillor Hollier and Councillor Jane Burton as our counterparts on audit and governance, with a view to setting up part 2, which may be kind of the hardcore fanatics who were really into it last time, but as long as we're quorum, it doesn't really matter. Sorry? I don't think it would make a very good film, but there you go. there now. Okay, so if we resolve to do that, that would be good. We spoke earlier about potential task and finish group on the issue of section 106, and Councillor Merritt bravely volunteered, I think, to sketch out potential aims and objectives of task and finish group. We don't really have an approved format for an aims and objective, a task and finish aims and objective template, although one has been concocted by me for a separate piece of work relating to dialect rights. I'm happy to share that as a potential example. Are you happy to have a crack? But feel free to ignore it and come up with an alternative. But if no, that's fine. It's just trying to, and it's something across scrutiny chairs we do need to, we're keen to do in terms of being better able to support task and finish groups if we can provide interested members with a template in which to kind of channel their thoughts and then instigate a process through which that can come to committee for approval, and then the group can get on with it. Thank you for that. We discussed at the last meeting possibility of doing potentially having a task and finish group looking at cost and benefit of different approaches to the way the council communicates and engages, and some of it which was touched on in the conversation we just had. I think there is scope to that. I'm inclined to, I don't know whether we want to kind of wait until the budget for next year is sorted out and we know where we stand in terms of resource. Not that I'm sure it's changed dramatically, but Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. So the next normal meeting of this committee is March.
18th of March.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say in any case, I can try and do a rough one-pager for the committee to have a look at.
Please.
And then at that point, people can put their hands up to say they're happy to work with me on it. I mean, I do have to say, I don't think it takes a task group to sort of realise that we should be writing to every household in the city with key messages a few times a year. I don't think it needs, a couple of months of extra work from councillors to communicate that to communications professionals. But if that's what it takes, or if we undertake the exercise and I become enlightened to a different perspective, then it'll all be worth it. So if members are potentially up for helping with that, I'm happy to bring a proposed plan to the next committee.
Thank you.
Get some volunteers, hopefully.
So if we kind of aim to have those kind of outlines, which we can include on the agenda under the work plan item for our March meeting, and then it's kind of publicly, it's open for everyone to see and comment on and add to. Councillor Eyre?
Just general point in terms of process, and it's been a long time to spend on this side, but when we used to have a process where scrutiny would make recommendations to executive, and then scrutiny would go to executive and say, we've done a task and finish group, this is what our task and finish group found, this is what we recommend, and then executive would either go, thank you very much, brilliant, we'll go ahead and do that, or thank you very much, but we're not going to do that anyway. Is that the intention of doing this? That's okay, because happy to volunteer for task and finish group if it's going somewhere, but if all we're going to do is sit and go, well, scrutiny think it's a good idea, and then it gets minuted and
no,
so we need that change.
So the work will be done. A number of recommendations will arise from that. Task and finish group will come back here to say, yes, we're happy with those recommendations. It'll go to executive for them to consider whether they want to accept or otherwise. In the course of the iteration of that work, one would hope we would come up with recommendations that were deliverable, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But yeah, so the intention would be to produce something that would go to executive, hopefully to be adopted. Happy? Okay. So that's work plan done. Urgent business, there is none. Thank you very much, members, for your time and participation. It's not 9:45, so we've got. I really can say enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.